Hi, I'm Rich Suttie, and it's my privilege to introduce Dr. Thomas Barnett, who is the author of a new book that's just coming out this summer called America's New Map. And Tom is going to be proposing in this book a new strategic dialogue on how America can reemerge as a global leader as we navigate what he's going to describe for us today and introduce at least one of these for you in this podcast, but three major shifts of globalization: climate change, demographics, and middle class consumption. It's been nearly 20 years, Tom, since you published your first book, The Pentagon's New Map. And in our first podcast, we discussed really the origins of some of your thinking along systemic and systems lines that helped create frameworks and really works well with storytelling, which you do in this book so admirably, so that we can grapple with the complexities and the comprehensive nature of this, and yet our minds can process it. Our minds can track, can follow. In fact, you use in this new book something called through lines, which you posit are guidelines for us to think through as they connect and interconnect with one another in threads, basically weaving together a fabric of grand strategic thought. And I really believe this is a great contribution to the dialogue that has been lacking along the strategic framework and the strategic guidelines. Tom, last time we discussed really the genesis of globalization, what the major drivers were, and how you came to understand globalization. And you posit in the first part of your book that this, in effect, is a Frankenstein's monster, or a monster of our own creation, something we gifted the world through our prosperity of innovative and creative and the pluralities that we have in America, but at the same time, something now we fear. Can you help us understand that a little bit more as we tee up this next section, which you're going to introduce as one of the key through lines that impact our grand strategic futures?
Sure. I think the key thing to understand from this notion of America's parentage of modern globalization is to realize, going back in history, we started out as 13 colonies with separate navies, separate armies, separate currencies, separate governments, separate everything. And we put together a system that would allow those 13 colonies to come together in a multinational union, in effect. And then we spent the next 150, 60, 70 years adding members to that union, not unlike what the EU has done for the past 30 years. So America averaged a new star in its flag every 3 to 4 years. And that process of states uniting, economies integrating, unrestricted investment flows and whatnot, trade at its freest among these various member states, that allowed the United States to become the economic powerhouse it became across the 20th century. If you look at countries with equivalent GDPs to our current state GDPs, I mean, we'd be talking about 50 countries whose population would encompass more than 2 billion people. So, for example, Canada is roughly the size of the New York state economy, even though it's twice as many people.
Right.
So we have to understand that we have knitted together these states, these sections, as they were called prior to the U.S. Civil War. And it was that integration process, the creation of a single market, that in itself was sort of an early form of globalization. We don't count the amount of trade between Wisconsin and Illinois. If we treated our individual 50 member states like national governments, then our trade numbers and our interconnectivity numbers would be astronomical. So understand that we are pioneers in this concept of globalization, and that we chose, after the Second World War, to export that rule set around the planet and to try to pull in from then Soviet bloc's grasp as many countries as we could that later formed the West and ultimately formed kind of the free world and our definition now of the global economy. We have successfully turned on the rest of the planet,
Yeah.
integrating instincts that we've had inside the United States all these years. And what that has done has unleashed economic power of other rising forces like China, which was a goal of ours all along to create a multipolar world. But now that we've achieved it and we are facing competition in very serious ways, not just in terms of economics, but in terms of who sets the rules for the international system, we've come to view this globalization as sort of a Frankenstein's monster. Yes, it may have been something that came from us and looked like us for a long time, but now it seems like something beyond our control and something that buffets our world as much as anybody else's. And that's been, I think, a hard thing for us to understand and accept.
Yes, and it's come relatively quickly when you consider timelines, and so it's not a surprise that we might struggle with the outcomes. But one of the major outcomes is this that you highlight is the super consumption. That's awesome and wonderful, and in prosperity, resulting. However, it has been produced, an unintended perhaps consequence, but certainly a consequence of climate change. And while there's myths and truths associated with climate change, and you lay out some of the data that supports what's happening there and where it's going, what your intent seems to be, Tom, is for us to understand how it shifts, how it's going to shift this strategic axis, because you start with maps, and I think, and you take us through the maps and what our mindset has been historically in maps, and how you shift or how you think it's going to shift across these strategic axes. Your second through line that is preeminent in the book is climate changes everything, the horizontal world made vertical. Can you help us understand how these shifts you think are taking place now, and what, what's going to happen in the future?
Right. Our fixation on the temperature rise with regard to climate change has kind of blinded us to the reality that, once the American system sort of propagated around the planet beginning after the Second World War, and we saw consumption and resource utilization kind of skyrocket across all indicators, it's not just that temperature around the world has gone up or that CO2 emissions have gone up. We've seen every sort of consumption, whatever it is, lumber, um, um, agricultural usage, manufacturing, anything that you can measure has gone through the roof in the last 50 years relative to the previous 500. So the American system that came along after the Second World War really unleashed a level of industrialization and consumption and travel and interconnectivity that just dwarfed anything that the European colonial models of the previous 500 years could do.
You should write about when white beat tall, why humans see an east-west world, and how this is changing or tilting, that I appreciate, our planet's strategic axis from that west-east history that we had to north-south, and which is really a rapid environmental transformation that we're in the middle of right now. Is that correct?
Yes. You think about back in 1950, we're only about 20% middle class on a global scale. Now we're more like 60%. That has triggered so much change in our environment that scientists now talk about the Anthropocene, the renaming the current geological age to one that describes the human impact, Anthropocene, the era of human control. And what that has been expressed as is we formatted something like 95% of the world's land surface in the last 60, 70 years. We move 10 times as much rock and sediment on an annual basis today than does Mother Nature through natural things like erosion.
Right.
And we've put 100 trillion tons of carbon into the atmosphere. All these things have so altered our planet that we have seen species all over the world, all sorts of life forms, move from the equator in the direction of the poles. They're moving up in latitude and they're moving up in elevation. And this is a resource transfer without compensation of an unprecedented nature. We're talking about roughly 14 million square kilometers, roughly 2 Australias, disappearing from the lower latitudes in terms of livable space and emerging in the northern latitudes in terms of previously unlivable space now made livable. So you switch 2 Australias from the lower latitudes to the upper latitudes, and you're going to see people move in response to that stimulus because they're going to find life increasingly harder in the lower latitudes. We're all going to find life a lot easier in increasingly temperate zones that are extending northward towards the poles. And if history is any guide, that means people are moving in a very profound way. And that alone takes us from an east-west perspective, I would argue, to a north-south one, because we're talking about the biggest resource transfer in human history and the biggest migration in modern history that anybody's ever seen.
For our thinking maps here, you turn this Middle Earth, this band, and it has all these migrations that are happening, and you're going to go in and we're going to understand those completely. You argue that North needs to integrate South or face disintegration. What do you mean by that?
Well, that Middle Earth band that extends about 30 degrees north and south of the equator, right now that's more than half the world's population. The sweet zone for human civilization is roughly the 27th parallel. Left to our own devices, that's where we congregated vastly. And it's sort of this sweet zone where it's just, a Goldilocks. It's just not too cold, not too warm, and it's just about right. And if you think about that parallel, it's just below the southern border of the United States. Okay.
And
that band is going to become increasingly unlivable upwards to 30 degrees north and south of the equator over the next 30 to 40 years. They're predicting with great confidence that we're looking at basically a replication of environmental standards and norms, ranges that would equate to the Saharan desert of today, meaning an average daily temperature of close to 90 degrees, which doesn't sound that bad. But if you're at kind of 90 degrees all the time and your variation is off that baseline, then you're talking about temperatures up into the high, hundreds, even into the high 110 to 120 range. Stuff that's really difficult for humans to handle, and that we're already seeing create certain environmental dangers to humans living in parts of the world like the Persian Gulf, where we're seeing, for example, epidemics of kidney trauma resulting from the fact that humans aren't built to live in those sorts of temperature ranges. So think about that Middle Earth. Think about more than half the world's population. Think about them being subject to Saharan desert situations and temperatures and ranges. And history says they're going to move. They're going to get off that dime. Now, we're already seeing this in terms of people going from rural areas to urban areas in that Middle Earth band because they can't make farming work anymore because it's too much drought, not enough water, too harsh of storms. We also see people moving one country over, which is those are the two major categories you see of migration: inside a certain country and then maybe to the next country over. But increasingly, we're starting to see people move towards the north in a very determined fashion. And the good example right now is the Northern Triangle countries, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras. They're the primary source of asylum seekers right now at the U.S. southern border. And they're really coming from the Northern Triangle that is itself subject to a massive and unprecedented drought these last several years, and to a series of hurricanes that have left them decimated, turbocharged by climate change, it is understood. So if you think about those people coming to our border now and stressing us out and making us feel like we can't handle that, that
Right.
already constitutes climate migrants at our shores. And that's only going to get a lot worse.
Yeah, and as a result, and one of your thought processes here, America needs to ramp up its game by innovating new forms of state affiliation for connecting south to north. These must broker more viable forms of statehood in the former, while modulating the flow of climate refugees to the latter, the goal of which being to keep the South's most resilient populations in place. So you talk about these challenges, and you do provide a number of strategic prescriptions, and that's what I really appreciate here, is the strategic aspect of it all, and is how we both embrace and understand the realities, and not just push it off into the mythical, political, divisive sorts of binary solutions that are often tactical, regardless of any strategic outcome. And
Well, think about that Saharan desert example. It's
yeah,
a vastly underpopulated part of the world. We're talking some of the most brittle and fragile and least powerful governments. And in many ways, we talk about the whole Trans-Sahel and the Saharan desert as being full of situations, local environments that are considered, in effect, no-go zones or ungovernable spaces, simply because they're too harsh and that the local governments there aren't strong enough to deal with that kind of environmental reality. If that's coming to the bulk of the world's population living 30 degrees north and south of the equator, then we have to realistically project that there are going to be governments that cannot handle this.
right.
Economic opportunities dry up, literally. They're going to become politically unstable, unfeasible. And if you look at those situations and say, I'm looking at state failure, perhaps on a very large scale, then your response is, I can send aid. I can try to wall myself off from that with military force. I can try to encourage investment. But if I'm going to try to encourage investment, I'm going to have to improve the political situation down there. How do I improve the political situation down there and get these places to do the things I think and the world thinks we all need to do to kind of modulate and deal with this crisis and challenges that unfolds? And, the carrot approach is a lot better than the stick. We can sanction these places, or we can offer them pathways to a better future, not unlike what the EU and NATO has done with accession of East European states, inviting them in, not because it makes sense economically in the near term, but because it deals with problems over time in a strategic fashion by socializing the risk. In the case of the East Europeans, the threat from Russia. In the case of Middle Earth countries looking ahead to the middle of the century, it's going to be the threat of climate change. Are we just going to ignore it and hope these people don't flood our shores in desperation? Or do we try to socialize that risk and extend new forms of belonging and membership down there that allows us to kind of share the burden and deal with these crises in a systemic fashion that we can benefit from and ultimately prosper from?
Yeah, and you bring this out really well in your third through line guideline and framework here when you discuss these winners and losers and a better future, assuming America assumes the leadership role that it can provide, as you just described, to both incentivize better behaviors and better decision making given these realities. And you all of that there in through line 3, and I think you captured all of these major migrations: economic, political, geopolitical, demographic, and you do a great wrap up there. In our next session, we're going to go to a topic that's perhaps a little near and dear to my heart in terms of international security, national security, and all of the power centers that exist today, and as they're shaping and evolving, the superpower brand wars, you call this, and we bring some of these through lines together as we discuss that and how both continuing with the global middle And it, as you described it, seeking protection from the future. Give us a little bit of an insight what you mean by that as you introduce this, and then we'll discuss it in full on our next podcast. But what is it? What is the global middle seeking protection from the future? How do you frame that?
Well, it's a kind of a basic economic determinist perspective on social divisions.
Mm-hmm.
Any society wants to have a bulk of its population located in the middle. Not too many poor, not too many rich.
Right.
What do the poor want? They want protection from their circumstances. What do rich people want? Frankly, cynically, you could say they want protection from the poor in terms of crime or what they consider to be an undue tax burden. The middle class is the hardest to satisfy because what the middle class wants is protection from the future or from uncertainty. They've achieved a good life for themselves. They want to preserve that wealth, all the things that preserve it, all the security aspects in their society that preserve their wealth, their houses, their savings, their careers, their access to technologies. And they want to be able to pass that life along to their next generation, their children and grandchildren, in such a way that they are able to kind of build up that capacity and that wealth over subsequent generations. When you freak out the middle class and give them the sense that they're falling behind and they're no longer going to be advancing, or that they might actually lose their middle class status, that's when you see political instability inside governments. And if you think about this global middle class having emerged more in the global south than in the global north, that's where we're talking about brand loyalty to various superpowers and the integration schemes they may offer to deal with this amazing threat that we call climate change. Think about it as kind of three vertical slices. There's the Western Hemisphere, there's the European African center, and then there's Asia. And if you
Right.
think of those three vertical slices and what's going to happen with climate change, if people move to the poles, then we're talking about, and we're already seeing Latin Americans move up towards North America in an environmental push and a migratory push. We're seeing Africans and Middle Easterners move up into Europe, and we're seeing the same sort of flows happening across East Asia. And one of the most salient examples being people from China moving up into Siberia. So think about the future with all these migratory pressures and ask yourself, what's going to be the superpower competition of note in that dynamic change environment? And I'm arguing in the book that it's basically who integrates North-South most effectively within their band.
Yeah, I look forward to that. That's going to be a great discussion. Well, as I do, I appreciate your eternal optimism on America's role. Again, to repeat, as you wrote, Americans do not endure history, we make it. It's our true superpower. And it's in this grand strategic discussion, not merely confronting rivals, but shaping this global environment that tames our worst impulses. We are the best thing ever to happen to our world. And that's actually said with a serious dose of humility and not arrogance. So I appreciate this conversation, Tom. I look forward to the next one as we continuing to wrestle with some of these really huge, but as you say, tameable challenges. Thank you so much.
Thank you.